Priya's laugh carried across the floor as she slid 4 plates onto a tray without spilling a drop of anything. Table 3 wants the risotto redone. Apparently, it's not creamy enough. She nodded toward the far corner without looking up. And booth 7 ordered another espresso he's not going to touch. I set down the wine glass I'd been polishing and glanced over. 6 Thursdays. That's how long Antonio Bandini had been claiming that corner like it belonged to him. Same booth, same navy suit with the open collar, same gold chain catching the light every time he moved. Same Rolex that probably cost more than my rent for the year. He always ordered the espresso. He never drank it. He tips well? Priya said, reading my face. And he's not exactly hard to look at. Oh, what's the problem? The problem wasn't something I could explain to Priya in the middle of a Thursday rush. The problem was that everything about Antonio Bandini registered wrong to me, not dangerous wrong, not calling someone wrong, but the quieter kind. The kind my forensic sociology professors used to call a controlled presentation. A man performing so perfectly it became its own tell. No problem, I said, smoothing my apron and catching my reflection in the side of the coffee machine, dark hair still up, a few strands loose from the earlier rush. At 27, I'd gotten good at looking unbothered. It was basically part of the job description. Velour was doing what it always did on a Thursday, couples pretending the week hadn't happened, executives sealing things over Bordeaux, in the whole beautiful theater of people who believed money made them unreadable. I'd stopped believing that a long time ago. I picked up the espresso and headed for booth 7. And that's when I noticed the man near the back wall who hadn't looked at his menu once, whose eyes hadn't moved from the back of Antonio's head in 20 minutes. My steps didn't slow, but everything else inside me did. I didn't run. Running would have caused a scene, and a scene would have gotten someone killed. I walked. Steady, unhurried, the way I always walked when I was carrying something fragile. And right now the fragile thing was the next 60 seconds. He was positioned at the far edge of the room, just inside the ambient light, close enough to look like he belonged, and far enough to disappear if he needed to. Dark jacket, hands slightly forward. The way he held his weight shifted to the balls of his feet, shoulders rolled inward just enough that wasn't someone waiting on a table. That was someone waiting for a moment. I'd written a paper in my 3rd year on pre-violence behavioral clusters. My professor called it one of the strongest submissions he'd read. I'd never once imagined I'd use it like this. I set the espresso down in front of Antonio without a sound. Then I leaned in close enough that anyone watching would think I was reciting the evening's specials, and I pressed 2 fingers lightly to his forearm. "Don't turn around," I said, barely above a breath. "There's a man at your 9 o'clock back wall. He hasn't looked at his menu. He's been watching the back of your head for 20 minutes. His right side is heavier than his left." Antonio didn't move. Not a flinch, not a flicker. He just stilled. Like something that was already still finding an even deeper layer of it. His eyes stayed level, fixed on the middle distance just past my shoulder. And for one strange second, I thought I'd misread everything and was about to get fired for whispering nonsense at a customer. Then his left hand, resting on the table, moved. Ma'am, it was nothing. 2 fingers, barely a shift. The kind of gesture a man makes when he's thinking or bored or reaching for his phone. The table by the window stood up. The couple near the bar stopped pretending to look at the wine list. The lone man by the bread station folded his napkin and stepped away from his chair. 3 people. I served all 3 of them tonight. I had refilled their water. I had recommended the duck. I had seen nothing. It was over in under a minute. No raised voices, no broken glass. The man at the back wall was simply gone. Redirected, I would learn later, through the service corridor before he ever reached his mark. Velour kept going. The couples kept performing. Someone at table 5 laughed too loudly at something that probably wasn't that funny. I stood at booth 7 with an empty tray and a heart rate I was working very hard not to show. Antonio picked up the espresso for the first time in 6 Thursdays and took a slow sip. "Sit down," he said quietly. "Please." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't one either. I didn't go back to my section. I'm still not entirely sure how that happened. One moment I was standing at booth 7 with an empty tray, and the next, Serena was at my elbow appearing the way certain people appear, without sound, without warning, as if she'd simply always been there and I'd only just noticed. "Your things are already at the entrance," she said. Not unkindly, just the way someone states weather. "I have 4 tables. They've been reassigned." I looked back at the floor. Priya had picked up my section without missing a beat, which meant someone had already spoken to her. Which meant this had been decided before I'd even set down the espresso. The black car was idling at the service entrance exactly where Serena said it would be. That bothered me more than the car itself, the precision of it. The way everything was already in motion before I'd agreed to any of it. I got in. I don't know why. Maybe because the alternative was standing alone on a sidewalk after whatever had just happened inside, and that felt worse. The penthouse was on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown that didn't advertise itself. Glass and steel and the kind of silence that costs money to maintain. The city spread out below like something decorative, something that existed purely to be looked at from up here. Serena set a coffee on the table in front of me before I'd asked for one. Oat milk, 1 sugar, the exact way I made it at home every morning. I looked at the cup, then at her. She sat across from me with a tablet and the composure of someone who had delivered uncomfortable information so many times it had long stopped feeling uncomfortable to her. "Your apartment, your building, your job are all handled. Suspended shifts, personal leave. You won't need to explain anything." She paused. "For your protection." "You've been watching me," I said. She didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it either. She just moved to the next item. "Your sister Claire, yes? She's been contacted. She knows you're safe. She thinks it's a work situation." A brief pause. "We didn't mention the specifics." My mouth had gone dry. "And my student loans? Do you know about those too?" Serena looked up from the tablet. Just for a second. 41,200 and change, federal. You've been paying an extra $80 a month since January. The room didn't spin. I didn't panic. I just sat very still and understood something I hadn't fully understood before. The man at the back wall with the heavy right side, he had been terrifying for 60 seconds. This was something else entirely. This was architecture. Patient, detailed, and built around me long before tonight. The espresso I'd never been meant to walk away from was the last ordinary moment I'd had. I just hadn't known it yet. I didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual for me. I'd never been good at it, even before my life had a penthouse, and a woman who knew my loan balance in it. But that night I lay on a bed that probably cost more than my car and stared at a ceiling I couldn't see and did what I always do when I can't shut my brain off. I started building a profile. Antonio Bandini. Controlled presentation, but not performative. The discipline was too old, too settled into the bones to be for show. The grief was older than the power. I'd clocked it the very first Thursday, something calcified behind the eyes, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from confidence alone. It comes from loss that has been lived with long enough to become furniture. At 2 a.m. I gave up on sleep and followed the smell of espresso. He was already in the kitchen, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, running the stovetop mocha pot with the focused attention of someone performing a ritual rather than making a drink. He didn't startle when I appeared in the doorway. He just reached into the cabinet and pulled down a second cup. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Neither," he said. I sat at the marble counter and watched him work. There was something different about him here. The restaurant stillness was gone. replaced by something quieter and more unguarded. "My mother made it this way," he said, not looking up. "She said the machine version was a shortcut. Those shortcuts were for people who didn't care how things tasted." "Do you still agree with her?" A pause. "I agree with most things," she said. Too late to tell her. I understood that particular wait. "Mine too," I said. 2 years ago." He set the cup in front of me and finally looked up. Really looked the way people do when they've just learned something that reorders how they're seeing you. We didn't talk about the restaurant after that. We talked about mothers, about the strange, specific loneliness of becoming an adult while someone who knew your whole history was still alive, and then the different loneliness after. It was the most honest conversation I'd had in years. That scared me more than any of it. Because warmth, I'd learned, had a way of making you forget what you were sitting inside of. 3 days later, I went back to Velour. That's what I told myself it was going back. Returning to normal. Picking up where I left off before a man with bad intentions and a heavy right side derailed my Thursday night. The bodyguard was already at table 4 when I arrived. I only knew because Serena had told me middle-aged, reading glasses, always order salmon. I'd have never clocked him otherwise. That was the point. My section was smaller. My salary, I discovered on my first pay stub, was not. Priya looked at me for exactly 4 seconds when I walked in, the way she does when she's already formed an opinion and is deciding whether to share it. She shared it. "You look like someone who's been somewhere expensive and didn't want to come back." I took some personal time. "Mm-hmm." She handed me my apron. "Your highlights look the same, so it wasn't a spa, but you're standing differently, like someone rearranged something behind your eyes." Priya had always seen too much. Normally, I appreciated it. I tied my apron and changed the subject. For 2 weeks, it almost worked. The rhythm of the floor came back quickly. Orders, timing, the small performances people put on over good food and better wine. I fell back into it like muscle memory. Some nights I almost forgot what was sitting underneath all of it. Quiet and structural, like load-bearing walls you never think about until something shifts. Then Antonio came in on a Tuesday. Not his night. And he wasn't relaxed. He was scanning. Shoulders carrying tension I hadn't seen on him before. Eyes moving across the room in that particular way that meant he was counting exits. He waited until I reached the table. Then he looked up at me with an expression that had no warmth in it at all. "Has anyone been asking about your schedule?" 4 seconds of silence. "No," I said. "Why?" He held my gaze just long enough to tell me the answer to my question was something I wasn't ready to hear. Then he picked up the menu. It started with a sound I didn't have a word for. Not quite an explosion. Not quite a crack. Somewhere between the two. And then the world compressed into pure instinct. Antonio's arm was around me before I understood what was happening. 1 second I was walking beside him toward the car. The next I was down, pressed against the cold metal of a parked SUV, his body a wall between me and the street. Glass from somewhere above rained down on a glittering sheet. Someone was screaming half a block away. Someone else wasn't making any sound at all. 30 seconds. That's all it was. I know because I counted not intentionally. Just the way the brain grabs onto something measurable when everything else stops making sense. Then it was over. Antonio's men moved through the street with quiet efficiency, in the chaos folding itself up and disappearing the way it always seemed to around him. He pulled back just enough to look at my face, one hand still at my shoulder. "You're okay," he said. Not a question. The strange thing was I was. Not fine, not unaffected, but okay in the way that mattered. My hands weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking from the specific electric aliveness of having just survived something. I recognized the difference. I'd read about it. I'd never felt it until now. Back at the penthouse, I sat on the kitchen counter while someone I didn't know cleaned a cut on Antonio's forearm I hadn't noticed him getting. The room was too bright and too quiet after the street. When everyone else filtered out, he stayed, leaning against the counter across from me, sleeves pushed up, watching me with an expression that had finally run out of composure. I don't know which one of us moved first. The kiss wasn't careful. It wasn't the slow, inevitable thing I might have imagined on a different night in a different life. It was what it actually was. Two people who had just outrun something terrible, grabbing onto the only solid thing in the room. Neither of us apologized for it. Serena came at 8 in the morning with coffee and a manila folder. She set both on the table without a word. Then she left the room, which told me everything I needed to know about what was inside it. I opened it slowly. Marcus Webb. I'm 22 years old, Velour's quietest employee, the kind of kid who showed up early, never complained, laughed too hard at his own jokes, and genuinely meant it when he asked how your day was going. It had taken me 4 months of slow Tuesdays to convince him he was smart enough for college. We'd written his personal statement together at the side station between the dessert rush and close, him crossing out the first line 6 times before I told him the first version was the best one. When his acceptance letter came, his mother dropped off a tin of cookies at the restaurant, and the kind with the crinkled paper cups, the kind you only make when something actually matters. I still had 3 left in my apartment. I'd been saving them. The photographs were clinical. The facts beneath them were worse. He had sold my work schedule and home address to a rival operative. Twice. For $1,200. Antonio's men had found him 3 days after the ambush. He'd been dead for 2. I sat with that for a long moment, very still. The specific stillness I realized distantly that I had only ever seen on one other person. Then something cracked open. I found Antonio in the study. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. He was 22 years old, I said. He made a choice. Antonio didn't look up from the desk. His voice was the same tone he used to order espresso. That choice had a price. He was a kid who needed money. He put your address in the hands of people who would have used it. Now he looked up, steady, immovable. I handled it. You killed him. I protected you. The silence between those two things was so wide I couldn't see across it. On one side, a kid with a tin of cookies and a first-generation college acceptance letter. On the other, a man who genuinely believed those two things were the same sentence. I picked up my bag from the chair by the door. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me. Demi. Don't, I said. I walked out. And for the first time since the night I'd leaned across booth 7 and changed everything. No one followed me. I took the train to Philadelphia. No car service, no black SUV, no one materializing at my elbow with a tablet and information I hadn't asked for. Just me and a window seat and the city dissolving into suburbs and then into something quieter, and for the first time in weeks I could breathe without calculating what the air cost. Tyler met me at the door with a beer and the good sense not to ask too many questions. That's always been his gift, knowing when his sister needed to be somewhere safe more than she needed to explain herself. We ordered takeout. We watched something forgettable on television. His girlfriend Maya made up the guest room with the good sheets and didn't make it a thing. For 36 hours I almost believed it. The ordinary. The out. Then Tyler's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. I could see the hesitation on his face, but he did. The way people do. And I watched the expression drain out of him in real time. Slowly first, then all at once. He put it on speaker without me asking. The voice was calm, unhurried. It knew Tyler's gym schedule. It knew Maya's full name and where she worked. It knew the exact date our mother's funeral had been held, a detail so specific and so private it landed like a physical thing. The message was simple. I came back. Or Tyler doesn't come home. The call ended. Tyler looked at me across the coffee table with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since we were kids, since the night we'd sat in a hospital waiting room and understood that some things don't get better. I stared at my phone for 30 seconds. Then I called Antonio. He picked up on the second ring. No surprise in his voice, no anger, just that quiet, terrible steadiness, the sound of someone who had already been ready, who had only been waiting for the call to make it official. "Send me the address," he said. "I'm already moving." Antonio arrived 4 hours later with 7 men, 2 vehicles, and a calm that felt almost obscene given the circumstances. He set up in the kitchen of a vacant row house 2 blocks from where Tyler was being held. Maps on the table, comms in ears, everything moving with the quiet precision of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. Maya had been taken to a hotel under a name nobody knew. The street outside looked completely ordinary. I stood at the table and looked at the building layout. "How many inside?" I asked. Antonio glanced at me, not dismissively assessing. 4 confirmed, possibly 6. I studied the response pattern his men had mapped from the last 3 hours of surveillance. Entry points, timing, rotation. Something about it was nagging at me in the specific way things nag when your brain has already figured it out and is waiting for the rest of you to catch up. Then I had it. "They're not rotating for security," I said. "They're rotating because they're anxious. Look at the timing, it's irregular. Trained operatives keep a rhythm. These ones are checking because they're nervous." I looked up. "They're not soldiers. They're messengers. Someone handed them a job they didn't expect to be this complicated, and they've been hoping it resolves itself for the last 12 hours. Nobody spoke. "Hit the entry point hard on the first breach and they scatter," I said. "They have no investment in this beyond the paycheck. Give them a reason to leave, and they will." Antonio looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at his men. "Adjust the approach," he said. "She's right." It took 11 minutes. The first breach hit exactly the way I said it would: loud, decisive, no room for hesitation, and the opposition fractured almost immediately, not heroically. Just people making the fast, instinctive calculation that nothing they were being paid was worth this, and moving toward the exits. Tyler came out of a back room with zip ties on his wrists and a cut above his eyebrow that looked worse than it was. He saw me, and his face did something complicated and relieved and furious all at once. I got him outside. I kept my hand steady. And somewhere in the space between the entry point breach and my brother breathing clean air on a Philadelphia sidewalk, something shifted in me permanently, the part that used to hesitate. I'm the part that used to watch from the outside and call it safety. It didn't close in fear. It closed because it was finished. They chose Velour because they thought it would unsettle me. That was their first mistake. I'd had a lot of time to think about this on the drive over. Anyone with training would tell you that going back to a compromised location is the wrong call, and that the scene of your exposure is always a liability. But those people have never worked a 3-year Thursday night floor. They haven't memorized the sound of every door. They don't know that the camera covering the service entrance has a 7-second lag, or that the 4th floorboard past the host stand announces itself if you step left of center. They chose Velour to destabilize me. What they'd actually done was hand me the only room in this city where every shadow worked in my favor. The restaurant looked different. Each empty candlelight burning low across tables that weren't set for anyone, chairs still tucked in, the whole room holding its breath in a way it never did when it was full of people performing their lives at each other. I knew this space in the dark. I knew which floorboards announced themselves, which corners the light didn't reach, where the service corridor bent left before the kitchen and created a blind spot that even the security cameras missed. I've worked here for 3 years. They'd been inside for 20 minutes. Antonio moved beside me with 4 men behind him and the particular focused quiet he carried when something was about to happen. We had come in through the loading entrance. My idea, my key code, My knowledge that the dock alarm ran on a separate system from the main floor. And I moved through my old workspace the way I used to move through a Thursday rush, unhurried. Reading the room. The opposition had positioned themselves well for people who didn't know the building, badly for people who did. I flagged 2 blind spots to Antonio's men without breaking stride, rerouted our approach through the service corridor, and had us inside the main floor before anyone registered the entry. And then I saw Enzo. He'd been with Antonio for a decade. I'd met him 4 times. Trusted, inner circle, as close to a constant as Antonio allowed anyone to be. He was standing left of the main position, weapon drawn toward the opposition, and something about the angle was wrong. The grip. The stillness that wasn't readiness, but waiting. I'd written a paper on pre-violence behavioral clusters once. Enzo, I said clearly. Left side. He's not drawing for the enemy. Antonio turned. 3 seconds. It was handled. Nobody spoke about it afterward. That's how I knew how serious it was. The silence that followed wasn't shocking. It was the specific quiet of men recalibrating something fundamental. The final confrontation ended in the kitchen. Of course it did. Same stainless steel. Same low hum of refrigeration units. The same room where I'd first understood what Antonio Bandini actually was, standing across a marble counter at 2 in the morning with espresso between us and grief we hadn't named yet. He set his weapon down on the counter and looked at me across the wreckage of the evening. Something in his expression had come undone in the best possible way. The composure still there, but softer around the edges, like a door left open instead of locked. "You keep saving my life," he said. I held his gaze. Someone has to. The candles in the dining room were still burning when we walked out. Low and guttering, almost gone, but not yet. Neither were we.